Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Friday, April 25th, 2025 at 1:04 in the afternoon. So we're back to continue discussing S-127, in particular the CHIP program that's within 127. And so we have Bob Flint with us. Bob, good afternoon. Thank you for taking time to join us.
Yeah, no, good to see everybody. Sorry, I'm not there in person. So I'm Bob Flint from Springfield Regional Development Corporation, and wanted to take a chance to an opportunity to talk about a project we've been working on for several years, which is the mixed-use redevelopment of the former Park Street School in Springfield, which could, in theory, benefit from this potential legislation you're talking about. I'm going to share my screen, and sharing is not turned on. Can I share my screen? I am the co-host. Okay. I'm sorry for talking. All right, where am I here? Okay. Hang on a second, I apologize.
Oh, no problem.
Back to this. There we go. Okay, let's try that. Can you see a picture of an overhead?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to orient you to the building we're talking about. This is an overhead shot of the former Park Street School in Springfield. There's the front of the building. We're going to be focusing on this part when I get into it. That should be a rear view. And then kind of a close-up on the original 1895 section of the building. And then see if I can do this. This is an update I did recently from the roof of the building to show what's going on in the project. And here I am, and hopefully you all can hear. Hi, I'm Bob Flint from Springfield Regional Development Corporation on a windy spring day here in Springfield. I'm on the roof of the former Park Street School and want to do an overview, literally and figuratively, of some of the exterior site work going on here. So I'm going to flip this around. And down below me, you see my finger, this is the boiler house. This was actually added on to this building in the early 80s, and that's where the boilers that heat the building still are, these big monstrosities. So we're still using them at the moment, for another week or two anyway, here in Vermont. So when spring comes, for real, this will go away. This will be demolished, and the main entry to the building will end up being in this general area, excavating down and going in at what will be the new ground level into the building, into the former basement of the building at ground level. So this area will be the main entry into the Park Street School. I'm going to walk around carefully, and you see the drainage pipe. We're putting in stormwater, wastewater, other things, lighting, and you see piles of soil as well, some of which has to go away, some of which is going to be used for fill. But the end game is to create a tiered parking lot that will tie this back area to the lower lot below, the former Marsh property, for those that know the community. And the idea is this will be significant parking for this building, as well as hopefully the eventual redevelopment of the former Parks and Wilson building, which is over there. There's the river. And what's cool is, with trees and stuff that's been removed, excuse my hand, you can see downtown, clear as a bell. And there's the co-op, there's the Com2 Park. See the work going on in the former Oddfellows building. Thank you, Pierre. There's the movie theater, and going down to the square and the Wilson block. Okay, I will stop sharing. How do I stop sharing? There we go. So that orients you to what we're talking about. So that building is 90,000 square feet. It was last used as a school 15 years ago. I went there a very, very, very long time ago. But it still has public use space in it. There's a historic gymnasium. There's an auditorium. But the occupancy of those has been limited by code requirements. The building also houses the Black River Innovation Campus, which is a tech-focused ecosystem. Much of the property, though, is vacant and has been for some time. So as part of our redevelopment, and as it relates to this discussion, it's our intent to convert the original part of the building, that section I showed on the left, into 25 housing units, which is roughly 20 to 30% of the overall footprint. So what you saw from my ramblings up on the roof may have been impressive, but even when all that work's done, we've got $18 million more to invest in that property, much of which is for the housing portion, and the vast majority is for energy needs and the building envelope. We have met with several housing developers and applied to the LIAC program, and everyone who comes to the building and the site says, boy, it's beautiful, it's historic, but no. Why? Because the math doesn't work. Within a mile of that site, including some of the things you saw in the video, we have over 400 income restricted units currently in Springfield. The average home sale price in the community last year was $236,000. We are sensitive and have concerns about any affordability covenants with this proposal. I know there's been discussion in House General Affairs about repurposing former school buildings. In fact, I provided some information to the Preservation Trust of Vermont to share with Chair Mahali today, I think. But when one inherits these facilities, they are what they are, which means the dimensions are a school, which means the conditions are that of a building that was built in the previous age, which means the infrastructure is certainly that from yesteryear. And they generally don't lend themselves to a single use. So as it relates to the draft, I think that's the most recent one. The definition of housing development, which is on the bottom of page 1 of what I saw yesterday, would ask for some flexibility to allow for these mixed use projects with a less stringent minimum square foot requirement for housing. Adaptive reuse of historic buildings requires flexibility. In terms of the use of potential TIF funding, I would advocate for expansion of the infrastructure definition to incorporate energy code. And I think that was briefly mentioned in committee this morning. SRDC has spent over $70,000 this winter just heating what you saw. And that's maintaining basic heat to keep the building from freezing. That boiler room that my hand was pointing at has 2 large oil boilers, one of which is a converted coal furnace, fully carbon footprint. We not only have to install a modern HVAC system, but we also need to address the entire building envelope. Within our region, towns have a variety of existing infrastructure. So communities like Springfield and Windsor, which were built for industry, have robust wastewater capacity, but need creative assistance, such as this proposed legislation, to help drive housing construction and any other commercial development. Any development in this region is tough because of the lack of return on investment compared to, say, Chittenden County or even the Upper Valley. And take note that even with the current TIF program, no town south of Route 4 in Vermont has chosen to participate. There are other potential projects in our region that could benefit from this CHIP legislation, from another proposed school reuse housing project about a mile that way, to a new housing development proposal up by the current high school, and a potential mixed-use project in Windsor that will be located next to the soon-to-be-completed Central and Main housing project, which Governor Scott and his team visited a couple of weeks ago. But back to our baby here, the Park Street redevelopment. This could be a wonderful test case for CHIP and project-based TIF, a property that was tax exempt and a brownfield that could be turned into a true contributor to our community, not only from a grand list point of view, creating workforce housing stock, but utilizing the historic features such as the auditorium as a catalyst for community activity, which leads into our downtown. So appreciate you listening to me talk about this for a few minutes and for considering what we're asking for.
Thank you, Bob. Questions?
Yeah, thanks very much. Have you been able to have you had the opportunity to review the drafts that are being reviewed by the committee? And I wondered if you had any comments about that.
Yeah, so thank you. Yes, I reviewed the draft that was released yesterday, I believe. I've got that in front of me somewhere here in my pile. So, the specific comments related to that were less about the chip board and the proposed chip board and VEPSI's role, and I'll let other folks sort that out. Seems like simplicity makes more sense to me, but I'm concerned about the definition of housing development and the use of TIF proceeds, which are the 2 things I mentioned in my testimony.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for making the time, Bob. And you may have mentioned this earlier, so please remind me, what is the percentage of Park Street that is the floor area that would be housing?
Yeah, roughly 25-30% is the plan. I think I mean, this has gone back and forth in terms of percentage of square footages and stuff, and we've been watching this in Senator Clarkson's committee. I think at one point, 25% was the number, which obviously is more applicable for our case than the currently proposed 60%.
What's your thoughts on usage of the rest of the property?
So obviously a gymnasium and an auditorium don't lend themselves to different uses than a gymnasium and an auditorium.
Right.
This public space proposed for the building, and as well as the space for the Black River Innovation Campus. Already one of their graduates from their incubator program is going to be taking additional office space in the building as well. So the intent is that it's multi-use and multi-purpose.
I think we understood that something like this could happen if we put percentages in. We understood that. And I think that's why we're contemplating creating this external board that can look at a project such as yours. And I think looking at everything that's going on in Springfield and say, this makes a lot of sense for the community, even if it doesn't meet the 60% mark, and give a recommendation to VEPSI saying, yes, we should do this, or no, we shouldn't, because here's the reasons. So I think that's what we're contemplating to get around that. What we're trying to do with CHIP is to create as much housing as possible. And so we want to make sure that that's what's going on. But if there are projects like this that make sense for the community, makes sense for the state, then that's something we should invest in.
Yeah, no, I appreciate those comments, and I appreciate the idea of trying to understand adaptive reuse and providing a mechanism for flexibility. Yeah. Again, I don't have strong opinions on a CHIP board versus VEPSI and roles and responsibilities. Simpler is better, but whatever works. I also, and I'm seeing Representative Duke there, I appreciate her comments earlier this morning, attending the VEPSI meeting yesterday about we had a successful application, thankfully, for a project here we've been working on. And part of that discussion was, how do you attract and retain the people you need for your workforce? So great that the business is going to do this expansion. Great that they're going to add these jobs. We've got to make sure we have a place for folks to live. So that's why projects like this are so important. Yep.
And I think, that's part of what should be looked at. Even though it's at 30% or 25%, how does this assist in businesses that want to locate there or are located there in order to get the workforce that they need? So, I think there's a lot of factors that can go into making a determination of whether a project should go through if it falls under 60.
Great, thank you. And just to reinforce my other point about the increased flexibility of use of the funding, and I think it may have been you, Mr. Chairman, that mentioned this morning an energy code and items like that. Those are killers on these old buildings, and just finding a way of potentially allowing TIF proceeds to provide for that kind of infrastructure.
Yeah, I think, what we're contemplating are, we're looking at two different retaining percentages. And I think, the first one would be a 70-85% with basic infrastructure improvements. Then the next tier would be, if you're providing mixed income housing, then it goes to 80-90 for retainage. Plus, there's other improvements that could be utilized as well. So, it could be EV charging, could be energy improvements, could be sidewalks and parking spaces and public facilities, a whole list of things I think that we're thinking about. And so, our intent is to allow communities to determine what they need, but also to incent, more housing in multiple income levels.
Yeah, I understand. And just to reinforce the point on energy is you have energy, but you also have to deal with the building. You know, you can't put a fancy, all electric system into a building that has windows and other things that leak like a sieve. So,
Ain't that the truth? Yeah, and that might be something that we might want to entertain for both. As the basic and basic infrastructure improvements that would be allowed for.
Right.
Any other questions for Bob? Bob, thank you for joining us, and you're welcome to stay on and listen if you'd like.
all right, very good. Thank you. Good to see everybody.
Good to see you too. Steve? Like to join?
Ready for me?
Sure.
I don't have any visuals or graphics or PowerPoint today because I only found out about this late yesterday. As a
Wow.
possibility. But there are various things I'd like to discuss, so bear with me just a moment while I pull out some notes. Okay. For the record, David White, President of White and Burke Real Estate Advisors, here purely on a volunteer basis, not representing my company or any client or anything else. And thank you for having me back and inviting me to be here. I'm going to be a little bit scattershot today because there are a lot of details here, and I've been trying to get into the weeds on this a little bit, and I would like to go through a few things that are top of mind for me, and then really have a conversation. Among other things, I did circulate sometime in the last few days, I've forgotten when at this point, it all blurs, some suggested amendments or edits and I'd like to certainly have an opportunity to address any questions there may be around those, things that I was trying to clarify or in some cases, amend. But I do want to address a few of the big picture items as kind of a starting point. And I think I will play initially off of Jess's testimony from this morning to talk about a few of the items. And by the way, I have not seen the latest version. I have it, but I haven't had a chance to read it. That just came out today. So my comments, I did rapidly, late last night, I got a copy of the 1.1 version. And so my comments really, that's the only one I've had a chance to digest to some extent so far. Let me start with the question of excess increment that Jess talked about this morning. I'm in her camp on that, very much so, that the as written in the 1.1 version, it frankly doesn't work, because in each case, not only because there might be a longer tail, a 30-year loan or what have you, but there may well be early years where there's actually a deficit, where the communities had to float a deficit for a period of time, and you need to pay that back. And you may also have multiple tranches of debt before you get your final debt, and know what your final debt service is. And you also will have related costs that need to get paid, and it may be a period of time before you really know what those are likely to be. And so looking at it the way that it was written in yesterday's draft, I don't know what today's draft says, yesterday's draft, I think, I understand wanting to put guardrails around it. Absolutely. I have no problem with that. But I think that the approach that was taken in that draft doesn't work. And I think I've got some alternative ideas of how it could be done, but given the timing of what's going on here and you wanting to pass this by Tuesday, I'm not going to get into those. And I think basically the suggestion and recommendation that Jess made this morning makes sense to me. The mechanism that's in the existing TIF statute works and would achieve the same purpose, that would allow the VEPC working with the municipality to determine, once they know what that debt's going to be, determine how much needs to be retained, and the rest can be distributed. I will disagree with one thing that I heard from her this morning, which is that in the current statute and rule, as I understand it, and she can correct me if she understands it differently, but I think she'll agree with this, that that when you do that adjustment, it is pro rata both the municipal and the education fund. That if you started off at a 70% and 85%, that when you drop it, you drop both and down till you get to the level of retention that is needed going forward. And I would see that mechanism working fine here. So I absolutely endorse that. Secondly, around the question that is of the percentage of housing development. I am, as I originally proposed this and contemplated it, there was a minimum threshold. And I have been increasingly swayed by the people who have argued that whether it's because of a situation like Bob Flint just talked about or others, that's not the right way to go. That said, where I have landed is kind of a compromise position, which is that I think 60% is too high. There are going to be many cases where it's not going to be achieved. I think there'll be more of those than you might think. Again, if you consider a downtown project where the first floor is entirely commercial retail, and maybe it's only 2 stories, you're at best 50% of the square footage is going to be residential. So I think that I would argue a 40% level is a reasonable level. I'm comfortable with that, although I understand the arguments to not have any minimum at all. And I think also it would likely, I'll leave there. But that then rolls to this question of a CHIP board. And once again, I think I'll describe it a little bit differently, but I'm with Jessica. I do not believe that a CHIP board is necessary. I think the VEPSI board itself can play that role. And I want to draw a distinction here. What I heard from Jess, both in prior testimony when in the Senate, but also today, is that where VEPSI staff doesn't, and again, correct me if I'm misreading you here, but VEPSI staff is saying while they don't have the capability of assessing the affordability requirements in terms of income levels and so forth, they do have the ability to assess whether the square footage is there. It's a simple matter of X square feet and Y square feet and so forth, and that they feel comfortable that the VEPSI board could assess whether or not a project that's seeking a waiver below whatever minimum you initially set, whether it's at 60% or the 40% I'm suggesting, that their board is perfectly capable of doing that assessment without setting up an additional board. And I will just remind you that one of the objectives that we had in developing this concept was to keep it as simple as possible. And setting up another layer here, I think is unnecessary. I think I understand why you would want to have that somebody assessing the flexibility in making that decision. I think the VEPSI board has that. It's got diverse representation on it. They take their job very seriously. I can tell you, I've been in front of it numerous times and have been squirming in my seat sometimes from all the questions that I get asked. So they're by no means are they a rubber stamp. And in fact, I think it's important to understand that even before we get in front of the VEPSI board, there's been so much due diligence brought that while in the end, it's true that VEPSI has approved every TIF district that has been applied for, there are a whole lot of TIF districts that never apply because it becomes clear they aren't going to meet all the various criteria. So it's not that they're rubber stamping things automatically, far from it. It's that there's all that process that happens in assessing a community's viability. I'm thinking about TIF in general, but I think the same thing would apply to CHIP. In assessing the community's preparedness and the viability of it from an economic perspective, and then all the interaction with the VEPSI staff before it ever gets to the board. So I think that the capability is there. So I don't see the need for the CHIP board. And I think it's a complexity that is unnecessary. It could all be done as part of one process, and that the VEPSI board could handle all of that. And if as a piece of that, you want letters from the Regional Planning Commission or the local affordable housing provider or some other entity, that certainly seems reasonable to me. Okay, so those, let me just bear with me here as I look through my notes. Okay, then let me talk about the affordability question. And let me start by saying I'm a strong advocate of affordable housing, whether it's what I consider capital A affordable housing, which is affordable to people 80% or in some cases 60% of median income or below, or however you want to define it, very strong supporter of it. And as I've thought, and so my sympathies here instinctively go toward having some kind of affordability requirement. That's just my own gut personal preference and sympathy and instinct. That said, don't underestimate the level of complexity and administrative requirement that would bring to bear. And I will talk about that in just a moment. But where that has taken me is how do I weigh that off, and I will describe it in a moment, against, again, ease of use and simplicity, particularly for smaller communities. And I have come down on the side of the simplicity and ease in this instance because of our need for housing in this state. The extreme housing shortage is more important in the near term, at least, than the affordability part of it that I normally would be strongly advocating. And so let's talk a little bit for a moment about why I see it as so complicated. And if you think about it for a moment, if you have affordability standards, that's going to require the developer involved to have to develop a process for the developer to obtain and assess the conformity of any potential tenants to those requirements, and then have to submit those to some entity. And I've heard from VEPSI staff that they don't have the capability of doing that kind of assessment. So somebody would have to then assess that. And then there would have to be ongoing annual compliance reports for some period of time. Maybe it's for the 20-year retention period. I don't know what the requirement would be. And again, somebody would have to administer that. So it becomes every time a new tenant comes in for the landlord needs to then ask for the income information, needs to assess that, needs to then be able to report, I would assume at least annually. And you've developed a layer of bureaucracy and complexity that becomes a barrier, I think, for this program when what we need is housing. And so as much as I'm sympathetic to it, and I've really struggled over this one, I will admit it, but I come down pretty solidly on the side of don't have those affordability requirements. We need the housing, and let's do what the Senate did, and to say, let's assess this after 10 years, see how it has gone. Have we achieved the purpose of developing more affordable capital A, but also middle income workforce housing or not? And then if there need to be adjustments, do it at that time. Right now, we need housing. So the couple of other things. Actually, one other thing, then this is in response to Gus Selig's written testimony. I'm very comfortable with his second recommendation that these should be for primary dwelling units. And I think there's some language to that effect that has been inserted. I'm very comfortable with that. I think it makes total sense. I then want to talk a little bit about part of the bill that it's possible people don't understand, which is because it's a little bit obscure, but the location criteria, as we originally proposed it, said Tier 1A, 1B, or those areas that under Act 181 are temporarily exempt until the tiers are established. And then we also put in this provision for existing settlements. And later the Senate put in Tier 2, and it subsequently has come back out in the latest draft that I saw. I want to talk about the existing settlement piece, because that one's a little bit obscure and people may not understand what that is. Within Act 250, underneath criterion 9L, the so-called scattered, I've forgotten what they call it, scattered development criterion, there is a statutory definition for existing settlement, and that's the one that's cited in the draft legislation. And I've got it right here in front of me. I want to read it to you because the intent here is that this would be usable for small towns that don't have a designated center. They don't have the staff, they don't have all the pieces you would need to be, have a designated downtown or a designated village center or what have you. So they wouldn't fall under criterion 1A or 1B. But I think it is very important that the small communities, it's been one of our focuses from the beginning, be able to use this tool. And that's the purpose of this one. And the idea here, and I'll read the language in a moment, but let me give you the idea. The idea is that an existing settlement is one that has a mix of uses. It might be a church, it might be the town offices, it might be a school, it might be some commercial use, but that also has greater residential density than the surrounding countryside. So think about, so many countless numbers of smaller villages and hamlets around Vermont. I think about the corner of in Addison, for example, Road 22A, and I've forgotten what the crossroad is, where there's a little hamlet village there that I presume doesn't have a designation, but I believe would qualify under this. And so let me just read the language of what this says. An existing settlement means an area that constitutes one of the following. The first is a designated center. That's not what I'm talking about here. Or an existing center that is compact in form and size, that contains a mixture of uses that include a substantial residential component and that are within walking distance of each other, that has significantly higher densities than the densities that occur outside the center, and that is typically served by municipal infrastructure such as, it's not saying you have to have these things, but such as water, wastewater, sidewalks. There's a lot of small villages don't have water, wastewater, we know that. Sidewalks, paths, transit, parking areas, and public parks or greens. You could add to this, it doesn't say it, but schools and town offices and so forth. And strict development outside an area described above, it does not constitute an existing settlement. And then the way we wrote it also said, and areas within, I believe, was a half mile of that. So it would allow you to look at those properties that may not be developed currently, but that abut that existing settlement and allow that to happen. And so we were trying to make this work for the smaller communities by having that definition in there. And it was kind of core to the concept. And we didn't go for tier 2. And this is a political judgment that I'm not going to make. I'm just explaining our thinking. We didn't go for tier 2, mostly for politics, that because there's such a focus in the planning world in Vermont on keeping that distinction between village centers and open countryside, that tier 2 might encompass more areas than some people are politically comfortable with. That's why we included this piece. And we didn't want people who would be concerned about sprawling out to oppose this legislation because of that. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that was at least our thinking behind it. Okay, then, sorry, I'm trying to go through a lot of stuff here. Okay, improvements. Here's a key piece. So I also saw that in yesterday's draft, again, I haven't seen today's, that the improvements definition was changed from being examples such as to it's got to be one of the following. I think that's an enormous mistake. I'm comfortable with the notion of guardrails around improvements, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But let me talk about why I think that's a mistake. I think it's a mistake because we can't anticipate what the specific needs of a given project will be. Each project is unique and needs to be assessed for its unique circumstances. I could imagine a circumstance, for example, where a project is proposing a cluster of, in a village, small homes, and the town really wants to have a small playground or park in the middle of that. And that's not on the list, it wouldn't be eligible. I think it should be, rather than the developer have to pay for it. You just can't anticipate what the circumstances may be. And so I believe that the kind of flexibility that is in the TIF statute, which is what we base this on, remains appropriate. If you want to put guardrails around it, the way I would suggest you do it is, because I am sympathetic to that, is that whereas the TIF statute as written allows you to do kind of broad-based public improvements in the vicinity of a project, I would be comfortable personally, again, I'm not speaking for Let's Build Homes or anybody else, but personally, I would be comfortable with the idea that you put in language that makes it clearer, at least, that any improvement paid for through this program must directly serve the project, the housing project that's being developed. And that it can't be, sidewalks a mile away unless somehow you can show that without that, this thing isn't going to fly. And I'm not saying it's, I don't want to be too strong here in that it's essential somehow, because then you get into arguments about what's essential. Is that playground in the middle essential to make the project fly? But is it directly serving the project? If it's not, it should not be paid for through this program. This should be paying for the things that do directly serve it. But I think I would leave, I think it's very important that you leave this flexible as examples, not as prescriptive and limiting. Okay. Then I will, picking up on what Bob Flint said, I think I mentioned the other day when I think it was Representative Granning asked me about whether there, or maybe it was Representative Duke, I've forgotten, but somebody asked me one of the times I was here whether there were other uses. And I believe one of the ones I mentioned was energy improvements. And I think there's a very strong case to be made that you might want to add that in as an eligible use. Again, I think that's a judgment call for you to make. But I certainly would be supportive of that because we do have, I think our energy goals in Vermont are very important to the state, and it meets, a public purpose and a public good that we're going for. Okay. And so then we get to the issue of, what percentage retention. And I'm still at a place where, as I said in the suggested amendments that I circulated the other day, 80%, maximum 80% of education, and whatever that is, because sometimes some projects it could come in lower than that the municipal not be any less than what the education is, up to a maximum of 100% if the municipality so chooses to go that far. And I understand what you're trying to do, at least verbally, what I heard earlier about trying to incent these other things. And there's some merit to that, but again, it's adding complexity. And I'm a real advocate of keeping this simple so that municipalities, particularly smaller communities that don't have professional staff, aren't having to struggle over how do we put this together and looking at different variations of percentages and, cost benefit of doing it this way or that way. I think a simple, clean program, 80% of, no more than 80% of the education, and whatever that percentage is, 80 or less, that the municipals no less than that, but it could be higher if the municipality so chooses. And I'll still come pretty solidly down on that side of that. We already talked about that one. Bear with me. I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but I think all that stuff is fine. I'll talk about that. Okay. So, I could go through some of my proposed amendments, or I could just pause there and have a discussion, ask questions, give responses. I can address anything that there may be confusion about in terms of what I suggested in the way of edits, or I could go through the edits. You tell me. How can I be helpful?
Probably be good for questions.
I don't have any questions. Yes, I do.
That would be the first time if that were true.
Thanks for coming in, share, your thoughts on this. And I recall, talking about some of these issues and affordability, you talked about that and your preference around that. If something like that does get into the bill, I'm wondering if there should be some sort of distinction between a larger project and a smaller project. to indicate that, or if I heard him correctly, that smaller units you really couldn't do that with, and I'm wondering what you think about. I'm wondering what you think about that notion.
So it's a really good question. So first of all, start with, when you do that, the other units subsidize the affordable units. Absolutely. That is the way that happens unless you bring in other resources. There are some projects where a developer will partner up with a local nonprofit who will then bring in money from Vermont Housing Conservation Board, maybe low-income housing tax credits, and they are able to do it that way. But when that's not available, then you absolutely are forcing the other units to subsidize. And sometimes even with those others, you've got to subsidize. And that intrinsically raises the cost of those other units because they've got to then, have the revenue to do that. So that's a real issue. And there's no question that that's more feasible to do that on a larger project. But, it's still a burden on those other units in any event. When you get to a small project in a small community, if it's, 4 units or 8 units, it would be, I don't want to say impossible, but boy, that would be a real challenge. So I think, you could, I suppose, if you're going to have affordability requirements, which again, I hope you don't, but if you do, you could, I suppose, make that kind of distinction. It says, okay, any project larger than 40 units, you have to do this. Or if you did it, you're eligible for these incentives. Or something. Again, that's a judgment call, and again, it's adding complexity, but yes, there's some merit to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. David, this is actually a little bit tied to Herb's question on the same topic, I should say. What I'm curious about is whether how affordable housing comes to be built in our states, if it has a lot of ties to bringing federal funding into projects. Are we in a current landscape of alarm around the future of how that happens? And if we are we yoking this initiative to a less seaworthy vessel than perhaps we had previously?
Is there alarm? Yes, absolutely. I at least personally have not yet heard anything that suggests that there's a move to get rid of some of the more important programs like CDBG and low-income housing tax credits. Given that this has been a rolling progression of unforeseen new initiatives, who knows what might be coming? And I and others are certainly fearful that those are the kinds of things that could be on the chopping block. But your guess is as good as mine around that. And when I think about, and I've forgotten whether we discussed this before or not, but I've had this conversation numerous times. We're in a position where the upper end of the marketplace works because wealthier people can afford to pay whatever they need to in rent or purchase price and da da da. And the lower end of the market works, at least to the extent that we know how to make those affordable, with capital A, affordable units, projects work through bringing in low-income housing tax credits and Vermont Housing Conservation Board and so forth. We know how to do those projects. We can't do enough of them because there's not enough of the money available, but at least we know how to do them. It's the in-between that's really, really hard. So this would be, I don't think we're tying this. If you're putting in affordability requirements, you may be tying it to something that's not as stable a ship as you'd like it to be. But if you don't have those, then you're not. You are simply providing another tool that'll help close the financial gap, whether it's an affordable housing project that otherwise would have relied on some federal source that potentially is no longer available, or whether it's a more of a middle income market rate type project.
And I think then because I think the next iteration of language allows for some discretion in what kind of who the ultimate customer of the housing is. My question for you is the customer is the developer, like is your standard non-affordable housing developer capable of or interested in bringing in an affordability component for an enhanced incentive? Is that something that is, oh, no, you need to have been doing this for 20 years to know how to make that stuff work. I'm just curious if that's something. We had our Homes for All toolkit that was sort of saying, you have space in the backyard, you too can get a unit in there. How complicated is this for someone who can build houses, but once we start getting into income restrictions and 15-year covenants or what have you, a different animal.
In my experience, most private developers don't want to come anywhere near the kind of the requirements of most of these affordability covenants and programs is what I meant to say, affordability programs, that they're way too complicated, they're way too scary, and they just say, I don't want to be there. There are certainly some who are experienced with who've done it, have discovered how to do it, and are willing to participate. But I would say, particularly the smaller builders, the chances of getting them to do this are slim to none. They just don't have these are individual people, who've got, handful of staff, and maybe they're even just small builders themselves trying to do, projects here and there. They don't have the capacity to do this, and they're not going to have the capacity. They could, working with the municipality, use the CHIP program. This, as long as it's kept simple, but you start to layer in these other requirements, and I don't think they're going to touch it.
Hi, David. I appreciate the keeping it simple. I think that there is logic there. I also, know that we have to set the guardrails to be stewards for public dollars, right? So we're trying to balance those two things. Early in your testimony, you mentioned, this is kind of changing the subject from that, but you mentioned multiple tranches of debt.
Yes.
My understanding with this program, you have an opportunity to bond once.
No, that's not the way it's intended. It's one project, but it might happen in phases. And there'll be cases where it makes sense to have successive borrowings because you want to minimize the negative cash flow in the early years before your private project hits the tax rolls.
Right.
So if you're going to have multiple years of infrastructure investment, maybe this year you're putting in the water extension, a year later you're doing the road over the top of the water or whatever it is, you might want to borrow those at separate times so that you aren't sitting there paying interest on money that you're not currently using. There may also be situations where you have a phased private project where it's going to be, 4 buildings over a period of the next 6 years.
That's not part of the infrastructure, so.
Well, it's not, but the infrastructure for each building might be. And so you might want to then borrow money. And again, I can't anticipate. You need to, I think the notion here is to keep this flexible so that you can allow it to meet the needs that will be unique to each project.
Yes.
And you have 5
Sorry.
years.
So, one approval process, and once you're approved, you're eligible to take out debt on what has been approved
Yes,
at different times.
yes. Well, 5 or plus 3 if you get an extension.
Right.
Right. So 5 or 8 years, yes. And if it changes, I would imagine a process of coming back to VEPSI to say, look, this is what we anticipated. It turns out, the market was a little bit different or costs have gone up, but you might have to go back to VEPSI the way that is done now with TIF, where, you go back for a substantial change if there's something materially different. You can't always anticipate what the market conditions will be in 3, 4, 5 years, or, how some other factor may change. You get a lot of tariffs and your development costs have gone up. Maybe you end up never building that final phase because it no longer works. And so you don't need to borrow that final piece of money to do that final piece of infrastructure. But this is fairly routine about how things are done in the TIF program with VEPSI. And so I would not anticipate that being a challenge.
It's less about less about it being a challenge and more about it being a known quantity for the funds that are going to be borrowed against from the education fund. And so with that, yeah.
I do, I would phrase that a little bit differently in that, again, these are projects that I don't think are likely to get built absent this program. And so it's a positive for the education fund, I believe, as the project unfolds. And it's delaying when the education fund will start to receive the full dollar tax value. But I believe in most cases, they wouldn't have received any of it if we didn't have this program. So I see that a little bit differently than what I just heard. Be that as it may, I think that what I would anticipate, because, and again, we're trying to keep this simple, is that we're talking about one project. It may be a phased single project, but it's one project, so that you would go in with an application that describes that entire project. We're proposing to build 4 buildings. We anticipate it'll be over the next 6 years. And here's, building 1, 2, 3, and 4, the sequence that we anticipate. Here are the pieces of infrastructure for each one. Here are the budgets for those. We've had an engineer or a cost estimator do the estimates. We have put in an inflator escalator for each subsequent year to make assumptions about how much the infrastructure cost will increase based on annual inflation of construction costs. And this is when we expect to hit the tax rolls, and here's the cash flow. That's the kind of thing we do routinely with TIF. And I would see the same thing here. It's just a heck of a lot simpler because it's one project on one site.
John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. Just to piggyback off that statement, when you receive that financing plan as part of the application, you could set out multiple lines of financing in that. So it wouldn't be that you lack predictability at the front. I would distinguish that from the substantial change piece, right? If something happened across the course of the project, you might have to deal with that's an unforeseen consequence, but just in terms of knowing impacts, you would know up front because people are contemplating a multi-year project and they're just saying, we're taking out a loan here, and in 2 years, we're taking out another loan because it's financially advantageous for them to do so. But it wouldn't be that it's unknown. It's just that it's stretched over to you.
Thank you. Yes. Much better said than I did.
So I have a question about sort of going back to the idea of affordability requirements. I'm less concerned about affordability requirements in terms of the lower end. And I mean, my concern would just be, I think all of us wouldn't want the program to be used for developments that are primarily luxury housing, for example. So is there, maybe it's just an intention language to say, because we need housing of 150% of AMI, right? Probably
Yes.
100% of AMI.
Absolutely. Yes.
Do we want housing of 500% of AMI? So I don't know if it's, I don't know if it's just a comment or just a thought about if an intention language of like, this, the bulk of the housing should be for, X.
I'm intrigued by that. Putting that kind of stronger intent language in, or clarifying it, and maybe even some statement to the effect that municipalities as they consider whether to enter into an infrastructure agreement with a developer, should themselves be assessing whether or not this is achieving the purposes of this CHIP program. And asking VEPC to, that becomes a judgment call that the board may, have to make. But at least if the intent is, so I'm intrigued by that, because if the intent is clear, that should give developers and municipalities in the first place pause to, hey, if this is all high-end housing, that's not the intent. Why are we even thinking about it? And so it may never even get to VEPC as an application. So I'm actually intrigued by that.
I would ask that if this is something that we think would benefit the program, that we figure out how to make it not only an intent language, but in the program somehow, in the application somehow. I think intent language is not enough.
Ask a question about that. David, so part of what we were describing earlier on, I think you'd mentioned wanting things to be simple.
Yep.
And wanting to create a mechanism that the housing development community within the state can avail itself of.
Mhm.
And if we're dealing with we've had a lack of supply
Yes.
over the years, is it realistic for us to create a policy that would be able to thread that needle of there's going to be demand, a lot of demand. We might expect to see the first things, I thought that we'd expect to see the first things probably be more on that higher end. And then over time, we would get a different, that the spectrum would move. Like, where are we moving? Where in the range is it going? We might see highest returns first and then something moving around. I'm just curious if you could help me understand a little bit of the dynamics of how housing is developed over time and where the market shifts, if it does shift, or does it just go to the highest echelon and stay there, in which case it feels like we need some mechanism in language to tell it to aim a little lower. But is that a realistic expectation if we want to stay accessible?
So let me tell you where my thought goes with that question, and I don't know whether it directly answers your question or not, but it kind of combining it with what Representative Granning and Representatives Granning and Duke were asking about. Where my head goes with that is, just bear with me, it's always scary to kind of think out loud, but I'm going to take the risk. Is there a way, rather than assessing the income eligibility of the tenants or buyers, to instead have a standard that relates somehow to what the asking prices will be on units for sale, or what the rental rates will be on units for rent, tied to the area, some percentage of the area median sales price and median rental rates, and you pick a percentage. Again, this is right off the top of my head here. You say that, okay, as part of the application, they've got to actually put in, here are, the proposed or anticipated rates, and that it would be, no more than on sales prices, I don't know, 150, 200, whatever, some percentage, I don't know what the right percentage is, of area median sales prices for units of similar size or whatever, and no more than, some percentage of the area median rents. And with the rents, you could do it right off of every April, I believe it is, the HFA comes out with a rental chart for every county and statewide, and could pick, 200% or whatever of that. And you simply have the developer do that and attest to it, or something like that.
Do we get like really value engineered housing out of that?
Well, you might, but I'm trying to figure out a way that doesn't create a lot of complexity and a lot of ongoing bureaucracy and complexity here. That is a simple kind of, because I'm very sympathetic to the idea that, the goal is not here to subsidize, at least for me. Let's build homes, and others may argue we just need housing in every price range. And to some extent, I get that. It's not my priority. And I'm totally sympathetic to the idea. It's certainly not the priority in this committee. So I'm trying to just come up with a simpler way of doing this that doesn't create the ongoing annual reporting and, the developer having to check, people's tax returns to see whether they're income eligible and so forth.
Thank you.
So I've been thinking along those lines for the same reasons that I think you have in terms of, what we'd really like to see, right? And I'm wondering whether there's still some distinction between a large developer and a smaller developer in terms of being able to do the kind of work for, like, like a 10 unit versus, 50, 75 unit, in terms of figuring out what the anticipated sales prices are going to be and all that. Any sort of, smaller, larger developer distinction there?
Sure, I think for the same reasons we discussed before. And certainly a larger developer or a developer tackling a larger project, one presumes has more capability in-house than, a builder working out of the back of his truck. And so there may well be some kind of distinction that could be drawn there. I'm not quite sure how to do it, but
Yeah, for the record, I'm Brett Long, the Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Economic Development. This seems like the right place just to remind folks that in our work, pretty much every week, we hear from an employer who has made an offer to somebody and the person doesn't take the job because they can't find housing. In fact, the auditor mentioned it, his department or his office, when he was testifying. So I think for this great opportunity to provide housing that works for workforce. And, in a lot of cases, these are professional organizations. So, I would hope that we could incorporate folks that are professionals being able to find housing as in addition to, the rest of the population. I'm not talking about $1 million houses, but making sure that, for people who are in a professional job and are interested in moving to Vermont, that this would be able to help them.
and that's to the point that I've heard Earl Weinberger speak, that we need houses at all price points. And I think that that's real. I can imagine a young attorney, wanting, kind of being recruited by a law firm who isn't making a ton of money, but making enough that
They're not going to qualify for.
they're not going to qualify for affordable, and they're going to want a somewhat nicer house, right?
Well, and just to, we've actually heard from from municipalities that are feeders for medical facilities, that they're not able to recruit doctors, physicians assistants, nurse practitioners. I'm thinking about Fairhaven, for example, because they do not have the housing stock that would frankly be something that medical professional would want to live in. And so as a result, they've heard directly from GE Aviation and from Rutland Regional Medical Center that folks have not taken positions because they can't find housing in their community.
I would agree. That's something I think we've all heard. And we're trying to balance what we're trying to do here with what other committees are going to do as well. And trying to walk that tightrope that allows us to do what's needed to be done without sending something out of here that is going to get thrown to the wayside.
I appreciate that.
Just to add, I don't think there's anybody in this room that doesn't know that the housing prices are in part driven by the housing scarcity, right? And we have housing scarcity. So any housing will help that. We all understand that, right? The question is, should we be using public benefit to help build the most expensive? That's the question. And so we know we need, more. We know we need them at all price points.
Are there any questions around, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at, but around the edits that I circulated? I tried to be as clear, and I did, I think, also provide a cover memo, which I neglected to bring with me, explaining each one of them. Some are very small, some are more
Go
substantial.
through them, David.
All right. I could actually put it up on the screen if that's helpful. We'll need to get though a login to do that.
Would the ranking member be willing to crack the window a little bit?
Virginia's gone, so it was making a lot of noise.
It was, yeah.
Fresh air.
So just fall.
And see.
Oh, that feels good. I even feel it over here. That's great.
You can see the heat actually leaving out. The chair and
You may now disregard my recent email.
Would you send me the link so I can do do the Zoom and share screen? Now my write-up was on not yesterday's, but it was on the prior version. So it's already some of it out of date, but much of it I think is still very much relevant. And I believe, John, you got a copy of my suggested edits as well.
I probably did.
Okay, here we go. Thank you. Connect in. Bear with me.
Okay, well, maybe we got a little bit of a reprieve.
Okay, if you can let me in. Thank you. All right. Okay. I do share the right document. There it is. Okay. All right. So first is just really minor, but I think of this as the community housing infrastructure program without the and. Really minor, but I think it just flows better. Then under housing development, I just wanted to add or renovation to make it clear. I was aware of the representative from Barry being concerned about, can you use this to, perhaps build a foundation that raises a home above flood level? And the answer is yes, that certainly has been the intent. Let's make it clearer. So I think in the definition, but also there may be other places it needs to be inserted, and I'm not sure where those all are. John is better at that kind of stuff by a long shot than I am. So just, where it's appropriate, put it in. Then under improvements, I believe in keeping things as clear in English as they can be. And I think the intent is that it be public or private. And while I fully respect from a legal perspective, changing from public purpose to public good may achieve that, but I think a lot of people reading it wouldn't understand that. And so I think just let's make it clear. Let's just put it in language that your typical person's going to be able to understand.
Right, laws don't always work. Right?
And then let's see. thought I was going down a page. Here we go. Let's say public or private. I just talked about that. Hang on. This is not going where I want it to go. So bear with me just a moment here. Okay, under purpose, simply, a little bit confusing. Some places this draft calls it the housing infrastructure tax increment financing. Other places it calls it community housing infrastructure program. I would just recommend that it be consistently referred to as community housing infrastructure program. The purpose of it is to simple little change, but I think again, just being consistent. Again, renovation, there may be other places. I just happen to notice another place it may go. Then with regard to the housing development plan and what's included, I totally agree with what is proposed to be included. It's just that there are two different places where it talks about expected costs. One is here in subsection D, and the other is the next page in F. And I just suggesting just cleaning it up a little bit. I also think of personally in terms of the way I and most of my colleagues talk about it in the real estate world, is that a pro forma has to do with operating budgets. And this is not an operating budget here. It is the construction budget. So that's why I said rather than pro forma, let's call it a summary. And then on the next page, just delete referring to the cost estimate because we've already acquired it in the prior one. Don't need to state it twice. And let's just say here we're simply talking. We previously said there has to be a budget. Now we're saying there needs to be a schedule. Right? So I'm not trying to change what's required, just simply proposing to clean up the language just a little bit. Then, okay. This one's a little bit more complicated, and I'm going to admit that I'm not sure I even fully understand it. This next one, I think I certainly understand the concept. So I mentioned last time I was here that I expected that Michael Gaughan from the Vermont Bond Bank was going to talk about special assessments. He did. I watched his testimony, but he didn't talk about how it relates to this. And this is our effort to try to figure out how we tie the two together. Let me talk a little bit about what I understand is intended here, which is that there's a possibility, a potential here to add a new protection for municipalities and a credit enhancement to make the debt more appealing and thus potentially get a lower interest rate when you go to the marketplace with the debt. And that is to have the site itself be its own special assessment district, where you have a contingent special assessment that would only kick in the event that the taxes generated would not be sufficient, turn out not to be sufficient to pay the debt service. And this wouldn't be used in every instance. It would be, again, part of what the developer would negotiate with the municipality. And if it's anticipated to be used, it would be tied in, it would be part of the infrastructure agreement. But the idea here is that it would only happen if the developer has agreed to it. And the idea is that, okay, taxes, we thought it was going to be, $20,000 a year. It turns out that it's only 18. The special assessment will kick in for that last 2 that you need. And it allows in the marketplace, it's credit enhancement. It allows the potential lender or buyer of a bond, if it's bonded, to say, okay, this has got extra security behind it. And so this, where is that? I thought I was on the right page. I'm not. Here we go. So this comes in on what was page 32. I don't know where it is in the current draft. Gets inserted in the as part of the tax increment financing plan that then refers to the next page. This long insertion is all about that special assessment. The first one just refers to this. And I'm not an expert in special assessments, I will admit, and you might want to ask Michael Gaughan about this, and it may be too late in the process to consider it, and I respect that, but it is and that's what that is.
It's something that the idea we've kicked around, but not had the time to develop. I think that's something that we're thinking about looking at to insert next year, along with possibly utilizing tax stabilization as a tool. But
All of which are worthy considerations.
It's all problem that we have.
I respect that. Totally respect that. Then, let's see. In this first insertion is simply acknowledging that it may be 5 years, but it may be 8 years. So it's simply clarifying under this one that the site doesn't automatically cease after 5 years if it's been extended. And that language just isn't clear the way it's currently written. That's all it does. It doesn't change anything. It just clarifies. The next one, though, is important to me, which is that it talks about, well, first of all, the first one, the if, is that in some circumstances, a public vote is not required. So it's just clarifying if it's required. But the next one is, it calls for the information shall include the amount and types of debt, related costs to be incurred, including principal, interest, and fees, and terms of the debt. Well, principal, interest, and terms and fees aren't knowable at the time you go out to the voters. It's not until you go to the marketplace that you get that information. So what you, I think, should be providing here are your projections or estimates. And that's all I'm trying to do. And I think it's a weakness in the current TIF statute that it calls for things that are not knowable. And so just let's not carry that, what I see as an error, forward into this. Just simply make it clear you've got to do a good faith estimate. That's all that's intended there. And the same thing's true about related costs. I think it should be a good faith estimate of related costs, but some things are, again, not knowable. Among other things, I think many communities have been shocked by how much the auditor's office has charged, way above whatever was put into the original budget. And the auditor's charges alone have blown the related cost budgets in communities. And so I think it can only be a good faith estimate. Then on, let's see, here we go, page 36. Just clarifying what, again, this is clarification. It's already there, but it's not clear in these two locations that you can use tax increment for not just financing related costs, but also you're allowed to use it for direct payment of a cost of infrastructure. So there may be some small pieces that rather than bonding for it, you directly pay for. And that's a part of existing TIF statute. And again, would be applicable here. That's all this does. Then, okay. Here is related to what we discussed earlier, which is my recommendation that you're going to do 80%, not more than 80% of education tax, and that it be and then whatever the municipal is not less than whatever the education is, but could be as much as 100%. And this ties those together. So it's, municipal property tax increment not less than the percentage of education property tax increment actually retained pursuant to subsection B up to 100%. Subsection B is the education tax. Okay, then this next one is actually quite important. There aren't that many bond councils in the state of Vermont. One of them is Thomas Maloney, with whom I've worked quite a bit over the years on various issuing bonds. And I ran this by him and he said, David, this is important. As a bond council, I want explicit statement that municipality may use the incremental taxes to pass through to pay the debt service for a sponsor or the developer. So all this does, it doesn't change the intent, but makes it explicit. And Thomas suggested to me that that would be very important to him as a bond counsel reviewing this on behalf of the municipality. And then the final suggested edit is in the section that is simply referencing the authority of VEPC to what it's supposed to do. Again, just for consistency, refer to it here as Community Housing Infrastructure Program rather than Housing Infrastructure Tax Increment Financing, just for consistency and clarity about what you're talking about. That's it. Happy to answer any questions about those or any other related topic.
No questions?
No, other than the special assessment issue, they seem to be more sort of clarifying and kind of suggestions. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're certainly welcome, and I'm happy to come back if there are further questions. And yes, I know. And I sincerely hope that you request that the Legislative Council take my edits and incorporate them. Ah.
Wanted, John. They need you for, no, they wanted. You're down for the Senate. Yeah.
Okay.
I guess for about 30 minutes, so.
review it.
The time this well.
Yeah, apparently. But when you're done, maybe you can come back.
I mean, I can,
Want to see if Rick?
if you guys need, I can see you
Thanks, John.
sometime.
Thank you.
Mr. Grant's records.
The door.